says continue.
Hello. Oh, people are joining in. That's awesome. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to DataEthics4All Live.
Hi.
Hello. I'm your host, Shilpi Agarwal, and founder of DataEthics4All. And today we have a really special guest. She is a criminologist, AI ethicist, and CEO of Urban AI. Please welcome Renee Cummings.
Thank you.
Welcome to the show, Renee. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
We have a few live attendees as well. If you guys want to quickly tell your name, and then we'll start the show.
Hi, I'm Susanna Raj. Nice to meet you, Renee.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Paula, and I love watching Renee. She's one of my favorite speakers, so I'm looking forward to this. Thank you.
Hello, Paula. Nice to meet you as well.
Adewale, we couldn't hear you. Do you want to go again? Yeah.
Hi, good evening. I am Adewale Babalola. Nice to meet you. You're welcome.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else wants to introduce themselves?
Hi, I'm Gabrielle from West Hollywood, California. Thanks for having me and lovely to meet you all.
Well,
nice to meet you, Gabrielle.
Welcome, Gabrielle.
Thank you.
All right. Renee, are you ready?
Yes, I am. I feel as though I'm in a pageant or something. Are you ready?
We are in our own judicial court, it seems like, right? We have a lot of questions for you today, and we have a whole panel of discussions.
Sure.
So algorithmic tools are being used widely in criminal justice today. From predictive policing that estimates where crime is mostly likely to occur, to pattern recognition tools that help detectives automatically discover related crimes, facial recognition tools that identify possible suspects from video footage, and risk assessment tools that predict a defendant's future risk for misconduct. So do you think AI is making the criminal justice system any smarter?
You know what? It's certainly making it more efficient in certain ways, because we've seen AI being very effective when it comes to challenges like human trafficking, sex trafficking, reducing things like interpersonal violence, domestic violence, also doing a lot of good things with crime forecasting as well, DNA analysis, statement analysis, and working within the context of mental health as it relates to criminal justice intervention. So there's been extraordinary work that's been happening when it comes to using algorithms in the criminal justice system. But where there is promise, there is danger. And I think what we have seen are some of the big challenges, facial recognition, where someone has been misidentified or wrongfully arrested because of an algorithm. We saw a situation recently with a man out of, I think, Detroit, very problematic. We've seen facial recognition being used to over-police and over-surveil vulnerable and marginalized communities. That intensive surveillance really feels like a form of re-victimization for many individuals in our communities, of course impacting individuals of color more than anything else. Of course, we've also seen predictive policing becoming very problematic. So problematic, you have the city of Santa Cruz in California actually banning it recently. So while there is an extraordinary amount of good that can come out of that marriage of criminal justice and artificial intelligence, and I'm right there on the frontier of it because I believe in it, what we are saying saying is we've got to be cautious. We've got to be cautious, and we've got to ensure that the technology does not create any short-term, as we have been seeing already, and long-term harms, because we've seen situations when it comes to sentencing where algorithms are really re-administering criminal justice, and many individuals are being sentenced by algorithms and unable to face their accusers, which are algorithms, when it comes to a situation of parole. So there's got to be an extraordinary amount of due diligence and vigilance when it comes to the using of the use actually of algorithmic decision-making tools. And I think it's about having an ethical approach, and we know it must always be accountable and transparent and explainable and fair when it comes to understanding the application of something like an algorithm to criminal justice, where the stakes are very high when it comes to decision-making.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to pony up on that ethical forefront that you mentioned. There are a lot of hard decisions about criminal justice, and they are increasingly being turned over to smart machines that use computer algorithms to analyze vast amounts of data to make these decisions. Also, such decisions as criminal sentences and bail decisions are being decided by these algorithms. There's a widespread idea that computer is objective, but we are increasingly aware that the design and implementation of these tools involves questions of judgment and values. Some of the ethical dilemmas of using artificial intelligence to address criminal justice issues are familiar to anyone who has watched Person of Interest, the CBS science fiction show. So what are some of the ethical challenges of AI in criminal justice?
Well, you've got to go back to the data, and you've got to go back to the question of diversity as it impacts data. You've also got to look at a history of disparity and inequality coming out of another history of systemic racism, particularly in the United States. So if you're using data that comes out of a system of bias and prejudice, you will appreciate that that data will also be biased and prejudiced. And since over the years, we've not had the computer tools, or we've not had the courage to really look at the data and really distill those high levels of toxic bias and prejudice that's in the data, what we've been doing is building systems, building decision-making systems, building algorithms on a data set that is prejudiced. So you would appreciate, again, that the decisions may not always be the right decision. So we have got to be very conscious of the data that we've been using. We've got to be vigilant. We've also got to ask ourselves, who's been at the table when we've been designing these algorithmic decision-making systems? What's the level of consciousness of these individuals? How open are they to the fact that something like subconscious or implicit bias is so pervasive and automatic in the human psyche that it can slip into the design process at any given time? And who's doing the detection and the mitigation when it comes to those risks across the life cycle of design when it comes to an AI system or an algorithmic decision-making system? So I think what we're seeing right now is that we have got to challenge our thinking about the data sets that we've been using, and not only challenge our thinking, but challenge the design process and the conceptualization of the designs. You know, why did we want to design, or why did we want to use a particular technology in a particular way against a particular group at any particular time in our history? Those are the questions that we've got. The design questions aren't only about efficiency and effectiveness and expediency and utility, because when it comes to designing an algorithm, it's a very deliberate process. And we've got to ask ourselves, where in that process did implicit bias slip in? So it makes the algorithm itself very questionable. And when something is that questionable or that skewed or that inaccurate, we cannot use it to make decisions about people's lives. The criminal justice system is a Netflix where it can be a hit or miss if you like a movie or you don't like it, or Amazon if you like a top, or you like a pair of sandals, or you like some earrings or some face products, right? The criminal justice system is where people's lives and liberty are at stake.
Yeah. Definitely. And so Michael Arkfield outlines a daunting checklist for judges to ensure that judges are complying with their ethical responsibilities while using AI. And it's a daunting checklist, just like you said. If I heard you correctly, what the two things that you really pointed out are is that AI systems are great, but we do need to look at the data that's fed into the models creating the AI. And also we need human oversight. We cannot just be blindly dependent on these AI systems to make these decisions that are going to change the life of humans, correct? So there are concerns about ethics, fairness, and accountability into the tools as they are developed. The real world machines are increasingly facing questions about whether they produce outcomes just as biased as the humans who built them. So how is the AI fraternity responding to these ethical challenges?
Well, I think right now the fraternity is speaking a lot about it because systemic racism is in the news and in our face right now.
Yes.
So we did see IBM and Microsoft deciding that they would discontinue with the development of facial recognition. We saw Amazon saying that they were going to put a moratorium on it.
Yes.
So right there and then we know that, the situation is priority. It's high on the agenda because the big questions right now in the US are questions of social justice and racial justice. And I think everyone wants to be on the right side of history right now. So we are making the decisions that we should have made a long time ago. But the decisions are being made. So I think the AI fraternity is responding. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really including and celebrating diversity as it pertains to imagination and as it pertains to solutions, because the more diverse solutions you may find. So I think AI is going in the right direction. I think we need to have some very open and honest and tough conversations. There's much more work that needs to be done, but I think the fraternity has now become a movement, and there are very strong minds out there and very committed and compassionate and passionate data scientists and ethicists who are working together to ensure that we get this thing right in real time.
Absolutely. There's heightened awareness around this now, which is a great thing, because now the whole world is paying attention to it's not the data scientists are not now working in silos, but they are the whole community. Everyone is coming together and making sure that we are on the right track of using these technologies in the right way that enhances the human life as per se. We want to use this technology that makes our lives better and not move us in the wrong direction, right? So I think that
Definitely.
I completely agree with you on that.
Having a human-centric approach to the ways in which we design, and of course, multidisciplinary collaboration, bringing all the different, pieces together when we create an AI system.
You talked about systemic racism, and I want to go there a bit. So there is, people feel that systemic racism means that everybody is racist, whereas it's the opposite. It's wrongly interpreted as an accusation that everyone is in the system is racist. In fact, systemic racism means that we have systems and institutions that produce racially disparate outcomes, regardless of the intentions of the people who work within them. So it wasn't designed that way, but somehow because of the data sets that we had, or the data that we had, the arrest data that we put into that, all those data and the models that we chose led to those outcomes. And so we need to somehow start to change that. There was also a powerful talk by Senator Tim Scott. He gave a powerful speech on the floor of the US Senate. And he talked about how he had been repeatedly pulled over by police officers who seemed suspicious of a Black man driving a nice car. He added that the Black senior level staffer had experienced the same thing, and he even downgraded his car in the hope of avoiding the problem. I guess most people of color would either have a similar story or know someone who does, right? And yet there is a deep skepticism on the right of any assertion that the criminal justice system is actually racially biased. So, how does systemic racism impact AI?
So systemic racism is much bigger than our data sets and how our systems are. Systemic racism goes back many, many years, centuries. We've got to link that to the whole movement to enslave African people and the whole question of enslavement. And you mix that with colonial thinking, colonialism, and how those systems were created. So you go back to the plantation and you go back to the mentality of the plantation and how the plantation was designed and what Black enslaved Africans were at that time. So it's really, really deep and rooted in the historic consciousness of societies. And because of that consciousness, we created systems. So the systems, be they political, social, economic, judicial, all of them have that initial ideal of bias and prejudice and people of color as less than or 3/5 of baked into the system. So it is so deeply rooted. It is there, and we may not think it is there, but it is still operating, and that's how deep it is. So when you look at the criminal justice system, the criminal justice system has made extraordinary strides since the enslavement of Africans, right? We've also seen some very prominent people of color who are also prominent people in the criminal justice system, but it needs a lot of work. It needs a lot of work. So what we are saying is we can't use AI to replicate those old biases, which means that we have got to apply more imagination to the systems we design to use in criminal justice. So we're not just designing tools to sentence people of color or designing tools to sentence Black and brown men quicker or to design tools to catch Black and brown people faster. We're not doing that with AI.
Or give them longer sentences even.
Right, or to keep them behind bars longer. So that defeats the entire purpose of something like AI. What we should be using AI to do is stretch our creative imagination and our moral imagination when it comes to the tools we are designing. So we need to make ourselves better with AI, not maintain the status quo, because that's what we've been doing so far, maintaining the status quo or making it even a little more difficult. Because what we've been seeing with digital technologies like AI would be digital profiling through things like predictive policing and facial recognition. We've been seeing digital redlining more and more when it comes to banking and loans and access to finance. We've been seeing digital victimization and digital marginalization. So what we were really doing is using digital systems to reinforce and to embolden systems that we need to get rid of. So what we need to start to design are the AI tools to detect and mitigate for those biases and those prejudices and those risks in our systems. And we need to ensure that future data scientists and developers and startup founders and venture capitalists don't invest in those types of technologies, right, that are really,
biased to begin with.
Entrenching and making things more deep. What we need to do is really disrupt, live up to our name as disruptors, and really disrupt and dismantle the systems that have not been equitable and that have created this kind of disparity that led to the explosion we've seen on the streets of the US and the explosion in thinking that we're seeing right now that's required.
Absolutely. Completely agree with you, Renee. We are talking to Renee Cummings on, AI, bias, data ethics on criminal justice. I want to stop here for a brief moment and let our attendees answer some live questions. Please go ahead if you have any questions for Renee.
I have a lot of questions, but I want to give enough time to everybody to share their views. So one of my question is that where in the process do you think bias comes in? Where in the process of AI ML training do you actually think bias sets in?
That's a great question, Susanna.
Susanna, I think it sets in immediately. Remember when we talk about subconscious bias or implicit bias, it's something that's in all of our minds. It's in our consciousness. We all have stereotypes. We all have biases that we deal with, even when it comes to things like food or clothing or style or colors, you know? And it's the same way we think about humans. So it slips in right there in conceptualization. Because if I'm biased about a particular group, or if I have a particular fear about a particular group, or I don't understand a particular group, or that group doesn't look like me, or through my history, or through my experiences, or how I was raised, I was told particular things about a particular group. When I begin my designing or my imagination to conceptualize what I'm going to design, those biases are going to slip in there just automatically. So it's there. It's there, and it slips in the conceptualization of the design, just in our imagination.
That's a great point, Renee. So what can we do to overcome that? I know the way we have been brought up, our social cultural values, that's who we are. That makes us, right? That's our profile, our personality. And it's so deep rooted. Like we all know, it's like conscious and unconsciously, we have those norms and notions. How can we break that? Because unless we break that cycle, we cannot change or bring change. How can we even try to do that?
Well, we've got to try and we've got to start. And we start with an open and honest conversation with ourselves first, looking at our biases. What are the things that make us biased about a particular group or a particular religion or a particular individual? If someone has a particular sexuality, or if someone has a particular gender, or how gender and disability and sexuality, we have all these biases. So we've got to really look at ourselves very, very hard in the mirror and ask ourselves, what are the things that make us uncomfortable? What are the things we fear about a particular race, gender, or sexuality, or disability? Why do we fear these things? And we've got to deal with it. We've got to deal with it, just like someone who may have an addiction to a substance or a drug. At every stage of the game, they have got to deal with their addiction and prepare for a relapse. And they've got to have a particular kind of education. So maybe it takes a combination of implicit bias training, that level of awareness, the constant reminder when we're doing things that, listen, I can be biased about a particular thing and I need to check that bias all the time. And there was a great study that came out of Data and Society in New York, and some fantastic scholars and ethicists there, led by Jesse Daniel, that looked at racial literacy. So maybe as we learn civics in school, we need to have racial literacy classes that treat with subconscious bias and make us more aware and mindful of these things. Before I got into therapy and counseling and psychology, I had biases. And I had to check those at the door if I was going to counsel someone who had an addiction issue, because I may have a particular thinking about addiction that made me part of the problem and not part of the solution for my client, right? So it's like a whole multicultural perspective where we've got to celebrate diversity, respect difference, and understand the importance of inclusion in our thinking as well.
Yes, I completely agree. I like your step-by-step approach, and I'm going to write that as a follow-up in the show notes. I think that's really, really important. Those are good steps for us to follow, like looking at ourselves hard in the mirror and being uncomfortable, realizing and understanding and accepting what makes us uncomfortable. Having this teaching this knowledge to students from the very beginning. We teach about everything, but we don't talk about such important things, and we teach them, I think, the wrong history also. I feel like even I've seen textbooks, they talk about, little bit touch on Indian culture. They talk about Indian culture in US society like it's like there's snakes and there's snake charmers and the goddesses are
stereotypes.
Yeah, exactly. They have like completely demeaned our goddesses and our gods and all that. So, the people here grow up with those kind of cultural biases, which is not right, because I mean, just like you said, we have to respect all religions, look at the good in everything, and the way it is projected makes us culturally biased to begin with, right? And we have to break that cycle. We have to present it in a light where students understand and respect different cultures, not grow up with those biases and enhance those biases.
Definitely.
I see that there are a few other questions in the chat. So if you guys want to ask live, Terrence, Deeply Product, Paula, I know you have sent some questions in chat. Feel free to ask.
Yes, I'd like to say something. First of all, Shilpi, thank you for this event. And Renee, thank you for your presentation. I have a problem with these new words, which I oftentimes find very offensive and disrespectful, like unconscious bias, when we're dealing with a lot of the same system, when it's flat out racism. I think we should not ignore that. I know there can be bias and, intelligently unconscious bias, but once again, we're dealing with the same system, not meaning to be pessimistic here, but a lot of times it's just flat out racism, as we're seeing now happening over and over again. And I think we need to be flat out honest and deliberate about, a lot of this. When we're talking about this so-called bias, I wrote in the chat about the initial human element, when the algorithm and data is created and inputted, starting from that point, the human element. And it seems to me, Renee, and I wanted you, if you can't speak to this, it seems to be, if at least some of what I'm saying is correct, more of regulation and legal issues once again. But we know from the past, just like with body cameras, supposing to be legal, but officers turning them off and not using them, that, when laws are put into place and what's the word I want to use, policies, they're not carried out. So we're back to that fight again. So I guess the main thing I'm saying here is the language. I don't want to be fooled by a lot of the new language that's coming out versus what's really happening.
Terrence, thank you. Thank you for sharing. So let me just explain to you. So the term implicit bias or subconscious bias is actually very, very old. It's an old term. It's not a new term. But I get your point. What you're saying is that the systems are overtly racist. And yes, they are. They are definitely overtly racist and definitely need to be dealt with. Of course, what you're also saying is let's not look at semantics. And it's just more than semantics. I mean, we just need the terms to explain the perspective. But you're quite correct. And then you raise an excellent point about enforcement. So whether or not there are laws or the laws exist, how are we going to get individuals to enforce it? Well, I think this is what we're trying to see, what we have been hearing right now with calls to defund the police and reimagine policing. And I think what we are going to see moving forward would be community-inspired policing, which is like a total upgrade to community policing. I think what we need to see more of is public engagement and stakeholder engagement when it comes to designing many of the operational strategies that police use in our communities. And I come from a law enforcement training background. That's what I do. I train law enforcement, and I've done a lot of training for them. But you see, when it comes down to that split-second decision, Terrence, this is where training comes out and where what's in our subconscious comes in. And that's why subconscious bias has got to be dealt with. And that's why there's got to be booster training probably every month, or probably images, or probably, using AI to create some sort of, images that people can see that keeps confronting us on it. Because when you get in that kill zone for an officer, or when you get in a situation, remember, police officers have two powerful things. One, by law, they are allowed to use violence in the course of their jobs. And two, they have something called discretionary power, which is they can decide to charge you at a moment, or they can decide to give you a break. But what we have seen historically in issues of policing, when there are interactions between people of color and officers who are white officers, well, we've often seen that those situations could turn into deadly situations very quickly, and they don't use that discretionary power to give most people of color a break. And then what you also see is at those situations, that is where training goes out of the window. That's where all the education and learning and policy decisions and administrative decisions go out the window. And that's what we have when what we have in our mind comes to the fore. And if that mind already has bias and prejudice and an implicit bias, then you know the kinds of decisions that are going to be made. But I definitely like your point. I feel your passion, and I know in there's a bit of pain, and I totally understand that as well. Thank you so much, Terrence.
One last thing, if I may, I think if more officers were properly penalized, we would see better decisions. And we wouldn't need to bring up this talk always about training. So when I talk about the human element, I'm talking about the human personal decisions too, once again, that are not being properly penalized. And I know I'm repeating myself, but I think doing so
it's okay.
will bring about better policing. So that's the issue I think we're dealing with. I don't think it's, unconscious bias or subconscious bias. They're being allowed to get away with it. They know they can get away with it a lot of times. As we have seen in so many instances, around the country and even outside of this country. And I think that element needs not to be ignored.
No, and you're quite correct. And there needs to be more, not only being penalized, they've got to develop early warning systems that really flag officers. Because remember, officers who use violence don't begin using violence the day you see them in a violent situation. It means they've been using violence from a long time before. So AI has been used to design these early warning systems to flag officers. But then it comes down, as you said, to disciplinary action as well. But even we have seen many big cases when it has come to police use of force and police violence. And if you go through the criminal justice system, you'll be shocked to see the amount of money cities and states and countries have had to pay out to individuals because of police violence. But then even with those systems, even with the discipline, right? You still have what's in people's minds. So it's got to be a combination of just about everything. And it has got to be continuous work dealing with the criminal justice system, law enforcement, and the kinds of individuals that are given those jobs. And maybe we can use AI to even flag their entire history, of who they are. But this is where AI is going to really have to use its imagination. But thank you for sharing. Thanks again.
So this is a fascinating discussion, and I think we all agree we can continue for a long time, but unfortunately—
Forever.
Forever, yeah, exactly. But we are almost out of time, but I want to ask one last question to Renee.
Sure.
It is clear that AI has transformative power and life-changing potential, as we talked so much about it. And the concept of automated justice looks scary, but it is such a big social responsibility. And according to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So what's the forecast for the future of AI in criminal justice?
I think the forecast could be very brilliant. I think our only challenge is going to be, because there have been calls to defund the police, because we're trying to reimagine policing, there may be an over-reliance now on AI, which could become more punitive. So I think the forecast is we've got to stretch our imagination. We've got to stretch our moral imagination. We've got to come up with some really fantastic, concepts and roll those concepts out into algorithms. But we've got to also understand that we've got to future-proof our society, and we've got to protect society. And I think we've got to ensure those ethical guardrails are there. We've got to build up our ethics when it comes to AI. We've got to also appreciate that you can have innovation that is ethical. You can have principled AI. And in everything we do, we must always ensure there is empathy and compassion in the ways in which we create our technical systems.
And look at the well-being and social justice for everyone. Without that, nothing we do is complete.
We've got to always remember that. Whatever we want for ourselves, we must want for that other person as well.
Everyone in the world, yes. Absolutely. This is—
I have one last question.
Go ahead.
I saw your background is in criminal psychology, and I see how you answered Terence Johnson's question, because implicit bias is rooted in psychology, and that term has been as old as mankind. So, but I just want to know that you have this whole knowledge bank in psychology and criminal psychology. Do you see that being applied actively within the AI industry?
I see definitely it can be applied, and definitely to create more community-led solutions, and of course deal with things like intergenerational trauma and intergenerational anger, the many things that combine with what we call criminogenic factors, you know, socioeconomic conditions, social isolation, the lack of social justice. And I think what we can do, if we get the right combination through urban AI, we could really empower citizens and make our officers even better, and protect not only our citizens, but protect our officers as well, and really give us a society that I think we all want to enjoy.
Great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Renee. Thanks, Susanna, for asking.
Thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure having you, Renee. We enjoyed our conversation, and hopefully we can do a part 2 sometime soon.
Definitely. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the questions. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful 4th. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.